All right, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff from the Old Testament. We're talking exile, prophecy, these wild visions from Ezekiel and Daniel.
Yeah, and what really jumps out is both of these prophets were right smack in the middle of huge turmoil for the Israelites, right? I mean, they're living in Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem. Talk about a world turned upside down.
Right, so you're surrounded by a foreign culture, your homeland's gone, your temple's just rubble.
Yeah.
Like, how do you even begin to think about hope at that point?
Well, that's precisely where Ezekiel and Daniel come in. And they're not just offering, a shoulder to cry on. They're laying out these really intricate prophecies about the future.
So how do these prophecies, like, how do they tie together what's happening to Israel with the rest of the world?
They basically show that the fate of Israel is woven into the course of world history. Pretty big stuff.
Okay, so let's start with Ezekiel. Now, he was a priest living in exile, right?
Yeah, he was. And he kind of picks up where Jeremiah left off, starting to talk about this new covenant, this idea that God's going to radically change how he relates to his people.
Right, but Jeremiah talked about God writing his law on people's hearts. What does Ezekiel add to that?
Well, Ezekiel, he gets really visual. I mean, he talks about God cleansing his people, giving them new hearts, putting his spirit within them. This isn't just external laws anymore. It's like total internal transformation.
Wow, that's intense. So, like, even in the middle of all this suffering and loss, there's potential for spiritual rebirth.
Exactly. And you see that throughout these exilic prophecies, this idea that even when things are the darkest, there's a possibility for renewal, a deeper connection with God.
Right, but it's not all just about interchange. Ezekiel also talks about a future leader, a shepherd king, someone to guide and protect God's people.
And this is where things get really fascinating. Because this prophecy, it links back to that Davidic covenant, that promise of an everlasting kingdom coming through David's line.
Okay, so is Ezekiel talking about like an actual descendant of David, or is this more symbolic, like a representation of the kind of leader they need?
That's the big question, isn't it? And for the Israelites in exile, it would have been huge. I mean, they're longing for someone to restore their nation, to lead them home.
Right, so we've got hope, we've got this promise of a new covenant and a future leader. But then we shift over to Daniel. Now, he's living in exile, but his situation's completely different.
Totally. Daniel, he's working in the Babylonian court. He's climbed the ladder, because he's wise. And he's got this knack for interpreting dreams.
And there's one dream in particular that's key here, right? The dream King Nebuchadnezzar has about this giant statue.
Absolutely. The statue's made of all these different metals, and it represents, get this, a whole line of world empires rising and falling across history.
Okay, so walk me through this. What's this statue look like, and what do the different parts represent?
Okay, so the statue's head, it's made of gold, which represents Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian empire, of course.
Makes sense. Gold, wealth, power. What's next?
Then you've got the chest and arms. They're made of silver. This represents a kingdom that's going to be, lesser than Babylon.
So even in the materials, we're seeing this decline, right? Like from gold to silver, there's less power, less prestige.
Exactly, and it keeps going. The belly and thighs, they're bronze, representing a third kingdom. Now this one, it'll rule a vast territory.
So maybe less prestige, but still powerful and expansive. So what's next? Iron legs.
You got it. Iron legs representing the fourth kingdom. And this one, known for its strength, power to crush.
Even. Sounds pretty intimidating. But then things get kind of weird, right? What about the feet?
Ah, yes. The feet. Iron mixed with clay, which symbolizes, it's a divided kingdom. Strong in parts, but also brittle.
So even this mighty empire, it's going to be fragmented, unstable, won't last. But still, it's a pretty impressive statue. I mean, this thing is huge.
It is, and that's the whole point. Daniel's showing Nebuchadnezzar and us that even the most massive empires crumble and disappear eventually. But there's more.
Wait, there's more?
Oh, yeah. Now, this is where it gets really wild. A stone just appears out of nowhere, not made by human hands, and boom, smashes right into those feet. The whole statue shatters. All those earthly empires, represented by the statue, they crumble to dust, blown away by the wind.
Whoa, that's a dramatic ending. Okay, so what's this stone represent?
That stone, that's God's kingdom, the kingdom that wins in the end over every earthly power.
It's like this ultimate battle between human ambition and divine power, right?
Yeah.
Like a reminder that no matter how strong we think we are, we're not really in control.
And for the Israelites, stuck in exile, this vision, it would have been a huge source of hope. Their kingdom was gone, yeah, but God's kingdom, that would ultimately prevail.
So we've got these super vivid prophecies from Ezekiel and Daniel, prophecies that offer hope when things are terrible, and they point toward the future where God's kingdom is supreme. But there's one more from Daniel, right? The one of the Anointed One.
Yes, and this one is particularly fascinating because it uses this whole idea of 77s, that's periods of 7 years, to predict when the Anointed One will come and even, his death.
Hold on. 77s. That sounds pretty complex. Can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, it's definitely a brain twister. We got to remember, we're dealing with ancient ways of thinking about time and prophecy and all that.
Right, so break it down for me. What exactly is supposed to happen during these 77s?
Well, Daniel, he lays out a specific timeline. Starting from a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, there'll be 7 sevens, so 49 years, then 62 sevens, that's 434 years.
So it's 69 sevens in total, which is 483 years, and then what?
Well, according to Daniel, at the end of those 483 years, the Anointed One is, and this is a direct quote, put to death and will have nothing. It's cryptic for sure, but it clearly points to suffering and death following the Messiah's arrival.
That's a pretty heavy prediction, but it kind of lines up with the suffering servant idea we've seen in other prophecies.
It does, and it flips our ideas about what a triumphant kingdom looks like, It suggests that the road to redemption might involve hardship, even sacrifice.
It definitely gets you thinking. So we've got prophecies about a new covenant, a future king from David's line, this timeline for the Anointed One. It's a lot to process. But how did the Israelites back then actually experience these prophecies? I mean, what did these messages mean for them day to day?
You got to remember, these prophecies were given to people who were completely lost. They saw their homeland destroyed, the temple gone, their whole identity shattered. They needed something to hold on to, some reason to hope.
So these prophecies weren't just abstract ideas. They were a lifeline for people trying to make sense of their pain.
Totally. And it wasn't just about clinging to hope for some far-off future. These prophecies were about finding meaning right then and there, in the middle of exile.
But let's be real, these prophecies are dense, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the symbolism, the cryptic language.
Yeah.
Is there like a key to understanding them?
That's part of the challenge and the beauty, I guess. They invite us to engage on all sorts of levels, to wrestle with them, to let them speak to us in different ways.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Just when you think you've got a section figured out, boom, a new piece pops up and changes everything.
That's prophecy for you. Not always straightforward. It's multi-layered, open to interpretation.
Okay, but what's the takeaway for us today? How do these ancient prophecies about exile and restoration, how do they connect to our lives?
Think about it this way. Exile, it's not just a geographical thing. It's a human experience. We all go through moments of exile in our lives. Times when we feel lost, alone, uncertain about what's next.
So even though we're not literally in exile, we can still relate to that feeling of displacement, that longing the Israelites felt.
Precisely. And those prophecies, they offer a powerful message for anyone who's ever felt that way. They say, hey, God hasn't forgotten about you. He's working behind the scenes. He's got a plan to restore things.
That's a message that really hits home. But these prophecies also make you think about power and empires. We see these powerful kingdoms in the statue, all these different metals, each one seemingly invincible in its time, but in the end, they all crumble away.
Yeah, and that image raises some big questions. What's it say about human ambition? Is the whole pursuit of power pointless in the end? And how do we deal with these power dynamics in our own lives?
It definitely makes you question your own place in the grand scheme of things,
Whoa.
Are we just pieces in a game, or can we actually shape our destinies?
That's the age-old question, isn't it? But for now, let's step back and consider this. If Daniel's prophecy about those 77s is right, what does it mean that we're living way past the predicted arrival of the Anointed One?
It's like we're at a crossroads where history and prophecy collide. And to figure out where we go from here, we need to dig even deeper into the heart of these prophecies.
Welcome back. So we're picking up right where we left off with Daniel's prophecy of the 77s, which he uses to predict the coming of the Anointed One.
Right, so just to recap, we're talking 70 sets of 7 years. That's a really long time. And I got to be honest, this whole 77s concept, it's still a little fuzzy for me.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those head scratchers. But, we're dealing with ancient ways of thinking about time and prophecy here.
Okay, so let's break it down. Like, what exactly is supposed to happen during these 77s?
Daniel, he gives us a very specific timeline. He says, starting from a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, there will be 7 sevens, that's 49 years, followed by 62 sevens, so 434 years.
Okay, so that's 69 sevens, which adds up to 483 years. And then,
Well, according to Daniel, at the end of those 483 years, the Anointed One is put to death and will have nothing. It's a pretty cryptic statement, but it definitely indicates that the Messiah's arrival will be followed by, well, by suffering and death.
yeah, that's a pretty heavy prediction. But it does seem to echo that idea of a suffering servant that we've seen in other prophecies.
Exactly. And it kind of challenges our expectations about what a triumphant kingdom might look like, you know? It suggests that maybe the path to redemption involves hardship and sacrifice.
It definitely makes you think. So we've got prophecies about a new covenant, a future king from the line of David, this timeline for the coming of the Anointed One. It's a lot to take in. But how did the Israelites, like the ones actually living in exile, how did they experience these prophecies? What did these messages actually mean for them in their everyday lives?
Well, you got to remember, these prophecies were given to people who were feeling, well, totally lost and disoriented, right? They'd seen their homeland destroyed, the loss of their temple, their whole national identity just shattered. They desperately needed a reason to hope.
So these prophecies weren't just some abstract, theological concepts. They were like a lifeline for people who were struggling to make sense of their suffering.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about, like, clinging to hope for some distant future. These prophecies were about finding meaning and purpose right there in the middle of their exile.
But let's be real for a second. These prophecies are pretty dense and complex, right? Like, how are we even supposed to make sense of all the symbolism, the cryptic language? Is there like a key to unlocking their meaning?
Well, that's part of the challenge and the beauty, I think, of these prophecies. They invite us to engage with them on so many different levels, to wrestle with their meaning, to be open to them speaking to us in different ways.
It's like we're putting together this giant puzzle, right?
Yeah.
And just when we think we've got a section figured out, a new piece pops up and makes us question everything all over again.
Yeah, and that's kind of the nature of prophecy, isn't it? It's not always supposed to be easy to understand. It's multi-layered. It's open to interpretation.
Okay, but what's the so what for us today? Like, how do these ancient prophecies about exile and restoration, how do they connect to our lives now?
Well, think about it this way. Exile, it's not just a geographical concept. It's a human experience. We all go through moments of exile in our lives, times when we feel lost, alone, unsure about the future.
So you're saying that even though we're not literally living in exile, we can still relate to those feelings of displacement and longing that the Israelites experienced.
Exactly. And these prophecies, they have this really powerful message for anyone who's ever felt that way. They remind us that God hasn't abandoned us, that He's working behind the scenes, that He has a plan to restore things.
That's a message that really resonates for sure. But these prophecies, they also make me think about power and empires. We see those powerful kingdoms represented in the statue, all those different metals, each one seeming invincible in its own time. But ultimately, they all just crumble and fade away.
It's a powerful image for sure. And it raises some important questions like, what does it say about human ambition? Is this pursuit of power ultimately pointless? And how do we navigate these power dynamics in our own lives?
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder about your own place in the big picture. Are we just pawns in a bigger game, or do we have the power to shape our own destinies?
That's the question, isn't it? But for now, let's take a step back and think about this. If Daniel's prophecy about the 77s is right, what does it mean that we're living, well, centuries after the predicted arrival of the Anointed One?
It's almost like we're at this crossroads, this point where history and prophecy kind of intersect. And to figure out where we go from here, I think we need to go even deeper into these prophecies. Okay, so we're back, and that last question, it's still kind of bugging me. We're living way past the timeline Daniel gave for the Anointed One. So does that mean the prophecy was just wrong? Or is there something we're missing here?
Yeah, it's a question that stumped scholars forever, pretty much. And there are a ton of different interpretations out there. Some people think Daniel's prophecy was fulfilled way back in the 1st century. Others see it as having like a more complex fulfillment, something that happens over time in stages.
So maybe it's not a simple yes or no, right or wrong kind of thing. Maybe it's more about understanding prophecy in different ways, accepting that there might not be just one right answer.
Exactly. And that's what I find so intriguing about these prophecies, They make you think critically, question your assumptions, be open to other viewpoints.
It's like we're part of this ongoing conversation, right? This search for meaning that's been going on for generations.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's not about having all the answers, but more about this thoughtful exploration of the text, and all its possible meanings.
It makes you wonder if these prophecies, maybe they're not so much about predicting specific events. Maybe it's more about showing us God's character, his big plan for humanity.
I think that's a really insightful observation. They remind us that even when things feel super chaotic and uncertain, there's a bigger story happening, a bigger plan unfolding, and God, he's in control.
Right. It's like recognizing we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves, a story that started long before us and will keep going long after we're gone.
And that ties back to that whole idea of exile we were talking about, right? Ezekiel and Daniel, they were talking to people who were literally exiled from their homeland.
Yeah, but you said exile can also be like a metaphor, right? For those times when we feel lost or disconnected, when our faith or our purpose feels shaky.
Exactly. And in those moments, when we feel most alone and uncertain, those prophecies offer a ton of hope. They remind us that even when we feel exiled in whatever way, God hasn't left us. He's working behind the scenes. He's got a plan to bring us back, to restore things.
It's like this promise that even when we can't see it, even when we're lost and confused, God's still there, leading us toward a future where everything's made right.
And that future, it's not some far-off mystical thing. It's about right here, right now, how we live, how we treat each other, how we work to make the world a better place, a more just and compassionate place.
So it's not about just sitting around waiting for some kingdom to appear. It's about living out the values of that kingdom every day.
Exactly. And that's what makes these prophecies from the time of exile so relevant, so inspiring. They push us to look beyond what's right in front of us, to grasp this larger vision of God's plan for humanity, and then to go and live our lives in a way that reflects that vision.
Wow, that's powerful. It's a call to action, right? A reminder that we're not just passive bystanders, we're active participants in making these prophecies come true.
Absolutely. And even though we may not have all the answers, even though the future might feel uncertain, we can still choose to live with hope, to work for justice, to trust that God's with us every step of the way.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by the sheer scale of these prophecies, their depth, but also I feel this renewed sense of hope, of purpose. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I hope you, our listener, have found it just as enriching. We've just scratched the surface of these texts, but hopefully we've sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep digging into their meaning, to see how they apply to your own life. These prophecies, they're not just about predicting the future, they're about changing the present. They're about inviting us to join God's incredible story of redemption and restoration.
So as you go about your day, just think about this. What are those exiles, those moments of feeling lost or disconnected that you're facing right now? And how can you bring hope, bring healing, be a force for positive change in those situations? Remember, even when we're in the middle of exile, God is with us. And his kingdom, well, it's closer than we think.